Part 1. Why Life Was Brutal in Medieval Scotland. Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. Tonight we begin with a little journey back in time. So dim the lights, grab a blanket, maybe even a lukewarm cup of tea, and let's float together into the damp, foggy, and occasionally head-scratchingly weird world of medieval Scotland. Yes, Scotland. The land of rolling hills, haunting lochs, and apparently a royal lifestyle that was about as comfy as sitting on a bed of thistles. So settle in and let your mind wander slowly over stone castles, overworked peasants, and nobles who had more quirks than sense. Now, before we start, let's set the scene properly. Imagine a Scotland somewhere between the 12th and 16th centuries. No central heating, no plumbing worth mentioning, and definitely no ready-made oatcakes. Winters were long, summers were short, and everything in between smelled faintly of, well, everything. Smoke, livestock, fermented drinks, and the occasional unfortunate rat. Life was brutal, but also, let's be honest, kind of endlessly fascinating in the most quietly tragic ways. And at the very top of this hierarchy of discomfort were the Scottish kings and queens, which might sound glamorous, but it was mostly just a series of elaborate headaches, poor fashion choices, and family dinners that doubled as psychological warfare. Let's drift gently into our first example. King Alexander III, who ruled in the 13th century. Now, Alexander was supposedly adored by his people because, well, he didn't make them fight the English for every single harvest. But he also had this habit of disappearing. Literally, one day he was out riding his horse, perhaps trying to catch a fish, perhaps just enjoying the outdoors because why not? And he rode off a cliff. His horse died too, which is tragic, but at least they were in it together. He was only 42, which by medieval standards was middle-aged-ish, but for us today is probably still figuring out your taxes. The disappearance caused a bit of a succession panic because, as is often the case, everyone else in the royal line had their own quirks and illnesses that made smooth inheritance unlikely. And inheritance, or who gets the crown next, was where medieval Scottish life started to get really delightfully messy. Let's float over to another royal disaster, shall we? Margaret, the Maid of Norway. She was the daughter of King Eric II of Norway and Margaret of Scotland. Very straightforward lineage, except that Margaret was barely a child when she was named heir to the Scottish throne. Literally a toddler, probably more interested in dolls than political strategy, and suddenly she was expected to solve centuries of political tension between clans. She set sail from Norway to Scotland for her coronation, and, well, the trip did not end well. She died en route. And just like that, the Scottish throne was up for grabs. Imagine explaining that to a court filled with nobles. Yes, your new queen just, didn't make it. Again, this is normal. Because why not double down on chaos? The resulting succession crisis led to years of political maneuvering, foreign interference, and generally passive-aggressive letters between the Scottish nobles and the English crown. All perfectly polite, of course, except for the subtle threat of invasion if anyone so much as sneezed in the wrong direction. And the people? The peasants? They were somewhere in the background, shivering in hovels, quietly hoping that their local lord didn't decide to take their cow because reasons. Life wasn't much easier for Scottish royalty either, even if they survived childhood. Take King James III of the 15th century. James. He inherited the throne at age 8, because, obviously, child monarchs are a great idea. He had all the typical medieval maladies, plus an unfortunate obsession with the arts, like sculpture, painting, and architecture, which sounds delightful, but his nobles thought it was suspiciously unmanly. Imagine trying to play politics with a king who was more interested in carving statues than quashing rebellions. Eventually, his nobles got so frustrated that they staged a rebellion. The rebellion wasn't violent at first. It was more a polite suggestion to please maybe let someone else rule. But things escalated. Eventually, James III met his end during a battle that he probably thought would be a minor argument in the countryside. Spoiler, it wasn't minor, and the king did not survive. So yes, tragic, but in a very dry, almost comical historical sense. And while we're on tragic and comical, let's not forget Queen Margaret Tudor, who married James IV. She was meant to bring peace between Scotland and England, a diplomatic union through marriage. But marital diplomacy in medieval Scotland rarely worked out as planned. Margaret's life was full of court intrigues, jealous courtiers, and a husband who was mostly just, well, doing his own thing. She ended up in a series of carefully polite, slightly bitter conflicts with her husband and then her own son, who turned out to be just as headstrong as his father. The lesson here is, in medieval Scotland, royal marriages were less about romance and more about managing chaos, and everyone was terrible at it. Now, moving away from royals for a bit, let's gently consider the daily reality for the rest of Scotland. Peasants, craftsmen, and minor nobles lived in conditions that make our modern complaints about Wi-Fi seem absurdly privileged. Homes were typically made of stone or wattle and daub, roofs of thatch, floors of dirt. Fires were used for warmth and cooking, but also doubled as a rather effective smoke alarm for the entire village, because if you lit the fire wrong, you might as well have set the house on fire. Plumbing? A luxury reserved for maybe the wealthiest castles, and even then, it was more of a decorative drain than anything hygienic. Waterborne disease was common, and famine could strike at any time. Life expectancy? Somewhere around 30 to 40 years, so when a king rode off a cliff at 42, the peasants probably just nodded and said, well, that's actually slightly above average. One curious aspect of medieval Scottish life was the relationship between clans. Clans were both protective and aggressively territorial. Alliances were fragile and often cemented with marriage or betrayal. It wasn't unusual for a noble family to feign friendship with a neighbor only to quietly kidnap the youngest son for ransom. Or, if you were unlucky, the whole family might get involved in a long-standing feud that nobody really remembered the origins of. The social landscape was in essence one giant, foggy, interwoven soap opera. And our friends, the royals, the kings and queens, had somehow sit on top of all this and make it look like governance. Usually they didn't. By now, you've probably noticed the gentle rhythm of Scottish history is relentless. One royal dies tragically, another child inherits the throne, nobles feud, life remains uncomfortable for almost everyone. It's a kind of soothing, if slightly depressing pattern that flows predictably from generation to generation. And it's not just events, it's the personalities. In medieval Scotland, the combination of ambition, superstition, poor hygiene, and limited medical knowledge created lives that were, frankly, exhausting to live vicariously through. So, let's leave this part of the journey here for now. Stretch your legs, sip your lukewarm tea again, and let the damp mist of medieval Scotland settle in your mind. Next, we'll drift into some of the more unusual royals, their eccentric habits, and the small disasters that somehow define generations. And remember, in Scotland, even tragedy could be a little bit ironic, and sometimes just a slightly absurd.
Part 2. eccentric royals, and quiet disasters in Scotland. All right, let's ease back into our medieval Scottish fog. Take a deep breath, maybe wiggle your toes under the blanket, and let's drift into the slightly absurd, mildly tragic, and endlessly ironic world of Scottish royals. Because if you thought life was tough for the average villager, imagine being a king or queen whose every sneeze could spark a political crisis, or at least an annoyed letter from a cousin in a neighboring castle. Let's begin with Mary, Queen of Scots, because she's basically the poster child for unfortunate timing and questionable decision-making. Mary inherited the throne as an infant, which is always a promising start. Her early life was spent in France, surrounded by tutors, governesses, and more gowns than a small country could reasonably supply. She was meant to return to Scotland as a young adult, to claim her crown and stabilize her kingdom. Spoiler alert, the timing was off. Very off. When she arrived in Scotland, the nobles were complicated. Some were loyal, most were not, and all of them had opinions. Mary, naturally, was young, charming, and probably slightly tired of etiquette classes, which made her a magnetic target for intrigue. She married Henry Stuart, Lord Darnley, whose personality could be described politely as a bit of a mess. Darnley, of course, was handsome, because why have someone uninteresting as a romantic disaster? But he was also arrogant, jealous, and not particularly helpful as a king consort. Together, they produced a son, James, the future James VI, but also a court filled with tension, secret alliances, and mild domestic chaos that occasionally escalated into outright murder. Not fun, but strangely soothing in its predictability. Young queen plus chaotic husband equals royal headaches for everyone involved. Speaking of James VI, he's an interesting case. He inherited the Scottish throne as an infant after his mother Mary was forced to abdicate. The irony, of course, is that he would later become James I of England, uniting the crowns. But let's not rush ahead. Young James was raised under strict supervision, which, in medieval terms, means a combination of obsessive tutors, stern regents, and enough paranoia to fill a small castle. He developed a taste for order, books, and careful observation, essentially the opposite of his mother's dramatic tendencies. But that's not to say life was gentle. Even as a child, James had to navigate the quiet war of factions among Scottish nobles, each one subtly trying to influence him for their own benefit. And as anyone who's been the center of a small, power-hungry court can attest, subtle manipulation is exhausting. It's like being in a room full of people whispering, "Oh, you'll make a good decision," if it's the one I like. The stress was real, though James would go on to develop a calm, measured personality, useful for a king, and perfect for gentle, monotone narration centuries later. Before we leave Mary, though, there's another subtle delight in her story: her time in captivity. After fleeing to England, she became essentially a guest in various English castles, which were less hotels and more carefully managed prisons. She spent years in polite confinement, watched by court officials and occasional spies, always under the gentle threat of execution. For someone who had grown up in the grand halls of France and Scotland, this was boring. And that's the thing about medieval life for royals. Even danger could be dull if it dragged on long enough. Mary's story is full of quiet despair, whispered plots, and ceremonial interruptions of daily life that never quite led to explosive outcomes. Perfectly hypnotic for a slow, monotone bedtime narration. Moving back to Scottish soil, let's drift into the life of James V, one of the more interestingly capable but unlucky monarchs. James V ruled Scotland at the turn of the 16th century, and is often remembered as reasonably competent, well-educated, and unusually interested in medicine and astrology. Yes, he read medical texts and was fascinated by the stars. Imagine your king staring at the night sky, trying to predict the next plague, while nobles argued over which castle needed repairs. He married Margaret Tudor, which, as we mentioned before, was meant to smooth relations with England. But marital diplomacy being what it is, James IV ended up engaged in all sorts of minor domestic dramas, including the ever-delightful challenge of raising children who were both heirs and emotionally complicated. Like most medieval royals, his offspring came with a mix of charm, illness, and personality quirks that kept him perpetually busy. And busy, in this case, meant running from one feuding noble to another, mediating arguments that nobody remembered the cause of, and occasionally trying to avoid death in battle, a pastime that would eventually catch up with him. Now, let's drift gently into the world of nobility eccentricities, which were everywhere in Scotland. Nobles had a tendency to develop interesting habits. One common pastime was over-collecting land or castles. You see, it wasn't enough to own a castle, you needed multiple, often inconveniently located castles, each staffed with a small army of slightly resentful retainers. Travel between castles was tedious and wet, involving horses, rivers, and roads that were more mud than stone. The nobles complained quietly, but also expected the king to support their ambitions. A classic win-win if you enjoy quiet frustration. Then there were the diets. The Scottish elite believed in an elaborate balance of foods, often determined by astrology or humoral theory. This meant that if you were ill, your physician might prescribe a breakfast of raw eels, a lunch of salted fish, and dinner consisting entirely of pottage with a suspiciously colored broth. Royals and nobles alike believed firmly in these treatments, which, predictably, didn't improve health much. Life expectancy was short, partly because of these helpful medical interventions. So when a king died young, it wasn't shocking, it was educational. The lesson being that even the wealthy couldn't escape the consequences of medieval medicine. Another curious quirk of the time was the obsession with appearances. Nobles spent an enormous amount of time on clothing, jewelry, and hair. Portraits often depict them as immaculate, but the reality was more ambitious. Fabrics were heavy, hot, and prone to fire. Hairstyles required assistants to apply substances that smelled like a mixture of herbs and wet animal fat. And yet, everyone followed fashion rules as if their life depended on it, which, in a subtle sense, it did. Social standing in court could collapse with a poorly styled coif or a missing jewel. So, even in the midst of famine, conflict, and political uncertainty, nobles could be quietly panicked about whether their sleeves were wide enough. Floating back to the monarchy, let's glance at James V's children, because children in royal households were both adorable and, as often as not, harbingers of disaster. James V had several offspring that survived infancy, which in itself was a small miracle. But each child had peculiarities. Some were delicate, some were temperamental, and all were intensely political. Their very existence could spark disputes among nobles, with factions arguing quietly over who should oversee which child, or which child might inherit which patch of land. Childhood in a Scottish royal court was less about playdates and more about quietly attending meetings with people who smiled at you while considering how best to use you for political leverage. Meanwhile, life for ordinary Scots remained slow and challenging. Peasants could be required to provide labor for castle construction, maintain fields for nobles, and pay rents in kind. Disease was constant, famine was occasional, and minor conflicts were routine. In some ways, life had a rhythm: work, eat, sleep, repeat, interrupted by occasional tax collection or the subtle threat of noble interference. It's a pattern almost soothing in its consistency, despite being profoundly uncomfortable. Before we wrap this part, let's touch on another quietly ironic aspect: royal inbreeding. Scottish nobility, like much of Europe, often married cousins to keep property consolidated. This resulted in a charming combination of genetic quirks, eccentric personalities, and minor health issues. The royals might be impeccably dressed, well-fed, and politically influential, but their DNA...
Part 3. Weird Habits and Quiet Meltdowns of Scottish Royals. Welcome back, friends. Nestle into your blankets again, maybe adjust your pillow just so, and let's continue our slow drift through medieval Scotland. Tonight, we're focusing on the quieter disasters, the strange, the mildly tragic, and the peculiar habits that colored the lives of Scottish kings and queens. You know, the sort of details you'd only notice if you were staring at a castle wall for hours while avoiding your duties. Let's begin with James III, because he really sets the standard for royal eccentricity. As I mentioned before, James III inherited the throne as a child, which is always promising for future chaos. He loved the arts. Sculpture, architecture, music, you name it, he probably dabbled in it, which, in principle, sounds delightful. However, his nobles did not share this enthusiasm. To them, a king interested in carving statues instead of quashing rebellions was suspiciously unmanly. Imagine a group of heavily armored men quietly whispering behind the throne, "Is he serious about marble while the north burns?" Their solution, naturally, was passive-aggressive rebellion, which escalated, as such things often do. James III eventually met his end on the battlefield, a consequence of artistic hobbies colliding with noble expectations. There's a small lesson here. Sometimes medieval royalty couldn't win by being sensible, and sometimes being sensible meant dying anyway. Speaking of unusual hobbies, James IV is another case in point. James IV was genuinely curious about medicine and astrology. He studied medical texts, observed the stars, and even had a personal interest in keeping his body healthy. Now, this might seem wise, except that he lived in an age when medicine involved leeches, mercury, and every imaginable mildly toxic concoction. Astrology was supposed to predict the future, yet it didn't prevent him from eventually dying in battle. It's comforting, in a quiet sort of way, to know that even kings could meticulously follow advice from experts and still end up in exactly the wrong place at the wrong time. Then there's Mary, Queen of Scots, whose personal life reads like a continuous series of quiet, tragic soap operas. Her marriages were politically motivated, emotionally challenging, and occasionally lethal. Take Lord Darnley, handsome, privileged, and possibly the worst husband imaginable for someone who needed quiet, predictable rule. Their marriage produced a son, which was great, but also a court filled with tension. Darnley's jealousy and poor decision-making escalated into domestic drama that culminated in murder. But the murder wasn't cinematic, it was bureaucratic, quiet, slow, and procedural. In other words, perfectly suited for bedtime history. Now, let's consider some more minor quirks that make Scottish royalty so endearingly tragic.
Many kings and queens had a penchant for obsessive routines. James VI, for instance, developed an interest in cataloging things, books, coins, people's habits. Every day involved careful observation, record-keeping, and planning for contingencies that would never happen. It's the kind of meticulous attention that historians nod politely and sleepy listeners drift off into gentle admiration. He also had a knack for making enemies quietly. A noble might say one thing, and James would subtly counter it over months or years. No shouting, no violence, just long, slow psychological chess. Exhausting, really, just to read about. Let's float for a moment to the unusual domestic habits. Many Scottish royals were somewhat fragile physically, and so they indulged in practices that seem mildly peculiar to us now. Warm baths were rare, but some nobles went to great lengths to heat them with various stones or hot coals. Clothing could be heavy and layered in ways designed more for status than comfort. Meals often followed strict rules based on humoral theory. Eat too many warm foods and your temperament might explode. Eat too many cold foods and you might fall ill. Subtle anxieties about health, appearances, and propriety permeated the daily life of royalty, and the consequences were often minor, slow-moving disasters rather than dramatic catastrophes. Speaking of minor disasters, let's not forget royal children, who added a delightful layer of complexity. Many royal offspring were frail, temperamental, or just a little difficult. A small cough might lead to hours of anxious deliberation over diet, herbs, and prayers. A tantrum could be considered politically significant. In some ways, childhood in a royal Scottish household was both mundane and endlessly dramatic, a combination that perfectly suits our gentle narrative style. The nobles, meanwhile, were quietly unpredictable. Many had eccentric hobbies of their own. One might collect falcons, another specialize in breeding horses, and yet another devote themselves to obscure scholarly pursuits. These hobbies, while harmless on the surface, often intersected with politics in subtle ways. A falconer might be accused of conspiring because he spent too much time with his birds. A scholar might be suspected of plotting because he wrote letters full of elaborate metaphors. Nothing dramatic, just long, almost imperceptible complications that could affect entire estates. Meanwhile, life outside the court remained monotonous and uncomfortable. Peasants continued to toil, weather remained wet, and famine or disease could strike at any moment. Nobles occasionally intervened, but usually only to protect their own interests. Castle construction dragged on for years, with workforces enduring mud, rain, and substandard meals, and yet there was a rhythm to it, a quiet, repetitive, and predictable rhythm that allowed even historians or sleepy listeners to trace the passage of time in a gentle, almost hypnotic way. By now you might notice a pattern. Scottish royalty and nobility shared a love of control, curiosity, and subtle obsession, combined with an almost universal vulnerability to slow-moving problems. Whether it was a mismanaged marriage, an eccentric hobby, or an overzealous physician, life moved along at a pace both relentless and a slightly absurd. To close Part 3, let's reflect on one of the quieter ironies of Scottish, medieval Scotland, the juxtaposition of privilege and fragility. Kings and queens had access to fine clothing, food, tutors, and armies, yet their lives were often dominated by illness, anxiety, and small, persistent disasters. Nobles enjoyed lands, influence, and ceremonial authority, yet daily life was filled with the tedious management of people, property, and appearances. Peasants worked from dawn to dusk with minimal security. And yet there was a rhythm to it, a quiet, repetitive, and predictable rhythm that allowed even historians or sleepy listeners to trace the passage of time in a gentle, almost hypnotic way. So, as we drift toward the next part, remember this: medieval Scotland was not defined by dramatic battles or heroic feats, though there were a few. It was defined by the gentle, continuous flow of human eccentricity, quiet suffering, and small, ironic disasters. And as we continue, we'll explore some of the most bizarre personal habits, mild tragedies, and awkward dynastic decisions that shaped generations of Scottish royals.
Part 4. Inbreeding, awkward marriages, and tiny tragedies. Welcome back. Settle in once more, adjust your blanket, and let's drift through a quieter, yet oddly compelling aspect of medieval Scottish royalty. The tangled web of family ties, inbreeding, and those small, awkward disasters that kept the entire kingdom mildly unsettled. If you've been following along, you already know that life in medieval Scotland was not easy, but when family got involved, it added a particularly gentle kind of chaos. Let's start with the concept of dynastic inbreeding, because it's oddly fascinating in a sleepy way. Scottish nobles, much like their European counterparts, often married cousins or other close relatives. This was less about romance and more about land, alliances, and property. The unintended consequences were subtle but persistent. Sometimes children were frail, sometimes they had unusual features, and sometimes entire family dynamics became slightly more fragile than anyone anticipated. This was particularly true in royal households, where the pressure to produce heirs collided with the genetic lottery in ways that could be charmingly inconvenient. Take James V, for example. His family tree was a small, dense forest of intermarried relations. Every marriage was meant to strengthen alliances, yet it also compounded minor health issues and eccentricities. James V himself had children who displayed the usual royal mixture of charm, frailty, and strong-willed personalities. Some survived infancy, some didn't. It was a slow, steady process of trial, error, and subtle disappointment, perfectly suited for our calm narrative pace. Then there were the awkward royal marriages that were as much political maneuvering as romantic partnerships. Marriages were arranged to secure alliances, prevent wars, or consolidate land. Emotional compatibility was rarely considered, which often led to a quiet, simmering tension at court. Queens and kings might smile politely at each other during banquets, while secretly resenting the match. Courtiers, ever attentive, noticed everything, and quietly recorded it for later use in letters, alliances, or passive-aggressive scheming. Consider again Mary, Queen of Scots, whose life was shaped by marriages that were never her choice. Her union with Lord Darnley, as we've discussed, produced a son, but also prolonged courtly tension. After Darnley's demise, an event that was slow, procedural, and bureaucratically tragic, Mary married the Earl of Bothwell, a decision that many historians describe delicately as questionable. The result was more scandal, more intrigue, and, eventually, her abdication. Life in a royal marriage was less about companionship and more about managing the steady drip of minor crises, each one slightly more inconvenient than the last. And speaking of minor crises, let's gently float to the lives of royal children, who added a layer of slow-moving drama. Infants and young children in royal households were a mix of joy, anxiety, and political leverage. Every cough, every temper tantrum, and every delay in walking or talking became a matter of concern. Tutors, physicians, and courtiers all had opinions, and disagreements were often polite but relentless. If a child survived infancy, their growth was closely monitored, their education carefully managed, and their marriages quietly negotiated long before they could form an opinion. It's almost comforting in its predictability. Royal children were simultaneously adorable, fragile, and inexorably caught in the web of dynastic obligations. Meanwhile, nobles outside the immediate royal family had their own slow-moving dramas. Clan alliances could be fragile, with grudges lasting decades. Minor disputes over land or livestock were often settled through prolonged negotiation, rather than outright violence, because nothing says medieval diplomacy like a polite letter that threatens subtle ruin over a missing cow. And all of this occurred against the backdrop of a physically harsh Scotland, cold winters, wet summers, and an endless supply of mud. Another interesting aspect of royal life was diet and health, which intersected with inbreeding and childhood fragility in curious ways. Royals had access to fine food, but nutrition was imperfectly understood. Doctors advised diets based on humors, and treatments could involve leeches, herbs, and other mildly unpleasant remedies. The result was a population of royals who looked splendid in portraits, yet were often delicate, anxious, or otherwise ill-equipped for the pressures of life. Small health issues could escalate into minor crises, and the family tree often amplified these problems. It's a slow, subtle drama, but with plenty of irony. And then there's the emotional side. Scottish kings and queens often experienced quiet meltdowns, which are surprisingly relatable. A king might retreat to his private chambers for hours, muttering about the inefficiency of his council. A queen might pace the halls, lamenting the difficulty of managing unruly children or impatient courtiers. These weren't explosive events. They were slow, deliberate, and quietly catastrophic in their psychological toll. Over the years, they shaped the personalities of rulers, heirs, and advisors in ways that were gradual but profound. One final note before we drift to a close. Ceremonial life, while visually impressive, often contributed to the exhaustion of medieval royals. Every day involved rituals, feasts, prayers, and audiences. Polite smiles, careful gestures, and precise language were required at all times. Even a minor faux pas could echo through the court for days. The nobles, too, were caught in these webs of obligation. Life was structured, formal, and, to the casual observer, endlessly repetitive, but with a steady undercurrent of tension and quiet humor, if you squinted just right. So, as Part 4 comes to a gentle close, let's summarize the rhythm we've discovered. Inbreeding, awkward marriages, and tiny royal tragedies created a pattern of subtle, ongoing chaos. Life in medieval Scotland was slow, predictable, and yet endlessly ironic. Royals, nobles, and even peasants navigated a world filled with minor disasters, eccentric habits, and gentle frustrations. And through it all, time flowed steadily,
The lochs shimmered, and castles, both grand and inconvenient, stood as silent witnesses to the quietly dramatic lives of those who lived inside.
Part 5. Clan Conflicts and Quiet Power Struggles. Welcome back, dear listeners. Settle in, adjust your blanket, and let's drift gently into the slower, more intricate side of medieval Scottish life. Clan conflicts, subtle political maneuvering, and the quiet tensions that shaped kingdoms. By now, you've seen how royals, nobles, and children could create small but persistent dramas. Now let's look at the broader social structure and how families, big, powerful, and occasionally absurdly stubborn, played their part. In medieval Scotland, clans were everything. They were families, armies, and minor governments rolled into one. Each clan had its own territory, customs, and, importantly, sense of pride. Pride, as it often does, could escalate quickly into slow-moving conflicts. Unlike battles designed to be cinematic, these disputes often involved a mix of formal protests, passive-aggressive maneuvering, and occasional cattle raids. Yes, cows were the unofficial currency of Scottish honor. A stolen cow could start months of negotiation, polite letters, and ceremonial displays of outrage. It's a level of subtlety that modern observers might find endlessly charming, if also exhausting. Take the Campbells and MacDonalds, for example. Their disputes were legendary, not because they were particularly violent, those skirmishes occurred, but because they were so persistent. Each side would engage in carefully staged maneuvers, sometimes decades long, designed to outmaneuver the other politically. A minor slight in one generation could ripple through the next, creating a chain of slow, ironic consequences. The result was a landscape filled with tension, ceremony, and the occasional strategically timed insult. The monarchy, of course, tried to intervene. Scottish kings often found themselves mediating disputes between clans, a task akin to refereeing a chess game played by people who occasionally wanted to kick the board over. James IV and James V, for instance, had to balance the ambitions of powerful nobles while also asserting authority over regional conflicts. This meant spending countless hours in council meetings, drafting letters, and occasionally riding through rain-soaked countryside to remind everyone that the crown existed. The irony was that despite all this effort, subtle conflicts persisted, much to the quiet amusement of history. Marriage alliances were another tool for managing clan relations. Marrying into a rival family could prevent war, or at least postpone it. Royals and nobles alike orchestrated these unions with meticulous attention to property, loyalty, and influence. Emotional compatibility, again, was almost irrelevant. A daughter might be wedded at 13, while her thoughts on the arrangement were politely ignored. Her new family might treat her with cautious politeness, always calculating whether she would be useful in some subtle political maneuver. The result: slow-moving domestic tension, occasional nervous breakdowns, and the kind of gentle drama that historians and sleepy listeners can appreciate. Meanwhile, clan members themselves were perpetually balancing loyalty and ambition. Younger sons, for instance, often received little inheritance, which meant they needed to find their place in the world through service, marriage, or subtle scheming. Elders were often preoccupied with preserving status and property. And women, who in some clans wielded surprising influence behind the scenes, had to navigate a landscape of expectations, social obligations, and occasional minor disasters. Life in this sense was structured, repetitive, and subtly stressful, a perfect rhythm for our calming bedtime exploration. Let's float briefly over to political intrigue at court, which was equally slow-moving and gently exhausting. The Scottish court was filled with advisors, clerics, and nobles, each with a slightly different agenda. Letters were exchanged, subtle threats implied, and every gesture noted. Decisions were often delayed until consensus, or stalemate, was reached. This meant that the monarch, while technically in charge, often spent more time managing opinion than implementing policy. Quiet frustration, carefully hidden annoyance, and mild exasperation were constant companions. And since life expectancy was shorter than today, the turnover of courtiers and advisors created a continuous ripple of adjustment, patience, and subtle recalibration. Another interesting aspect is castle life. Castles were both protective structures and small communities. Maintenance was constant. Roofs leaked, walls crumbled, and kitchens struggled to feed dozens of mouths. Nobles and royals had private quarters, but servants, advisors, and minor officials were always nearby. Privacy, therefore, was minimal, and minor domestic crises were frequent. A broken pipe might lead to a flooded hall. A burned meal could result in faint indignation from the head of the household. These incidents were trivial, yet cumulatively they shaped the daily rhythms of court life in ways that were predictable and strangely soothing to observe from a distance. Meanwhile, outside the castles, common folk endured their own slow dramas. Peasants worked the land, endured harsh winters, and navigated occasional raids. Travel was difficult, roads were muddy, and disease was never far away. Yet, compared to the slow burn of courtly intrigue, their lives followed a reliable rhythm. Sow, tend, harvest, repeat. There's something quietly hypnotic about that regularity, especially when contrasted with the layered anxieties of royalty and nobility. One more point about the monarchy. Scottish kings often struggled with succession crises. Heirs might be infants, sickly, or politically inconvenient. Nobles would maneuver quietly to place their preferred candidate on the throne. And if a king died unexpectedly, the country would enter a period of slow bureaucratic tension that could last years. Each delay was filled with polite correspondence, ceremonial displays, and minor threats of rebellion. Nothing dramatic, just the steady drip of historical inevitability. And finally, it's worth noting the quiet humor of history in all this. When you step back, you see a pattern. Minor disasters, eccentric habits, slow-moving disputes, and subtle intrigue shaped life in medieval Scotland. It was rarely exciting in the cinematic sense, but it was predictable, ironic, and strangely satisfying to follow. Royals, nobles, and commoners alike moved through their lives with small frustrations, tiny victories, and endless repetition. For the modern observer, or sleepy listener, it's a perfect lullaby of human eccentricity. So, as Part 5 closes, imagine the Scottish landscape at twilight. Lochs shimmering faintly under a grey sky, castles standing quietly in rain-soaked hills, and courtiers quietly plotting, negotiating, and occasionally sighing. Life was slow, subtle, and full of minor crises, yet somehow balanced in a rhythm that endured for generations. And in this rhythm, history itself becomes almost meditative, a gentle flow of small disasters and quiet resilience, perfect for drifting off into thought-filled sleep.
Part 6. Minor Rebellions and Daily Life of Eccentric Monarchs. Welcome back, friends. Pull your blanket a little closer. Maybe take a sip of your lukewarm tea, and let's float gently into another aspect of medieval Scotland. The minor rebellions, eccentric routines of monarchs, and the slow, predictable tragedies of royal households. By now, you can feel the rhythm. Life was subtly stressful, quietly dramatic, and filled with minor, ironic complications. Let's begin with minor rebellions, which were surprisingly common in Scotland. Unlike the sudden, cinematic uprisings you might imagine, these rebellions were often gradual, polite, and sometimes almost bureaucratic. A local noble might quietly withhold taxes for a season. Another might misplace some cattle belonging to a rival clan. Letters would be exchanged, emissaries dispatched, and a sense of polite tension would settle over the region. Nothing exploded dramatically. Instead, these events stretched over months or years, subtly shaping alliances and loyalties. For the king, this meant endless council meetings, careful negotiation, and a lot of polite sighing. One such slow-burning rebellion occurred during the reign of James V, who had to manage feuding clans while also tending to the usual royal headaches, fragile children, in-law politics, and minor household disasters. James V was, by most accounts, a competent king, but competence in Scotland often meant juggling dozens of small crises that, cumulatively, could be exhausting. Nobles would plot quietly, children would cry in ways that suggested political preference, and advisers would debate endlessly about the best course of action. It was the kind of stress that, if narrated slowly and monotonously, could gently lull a listener towards sleep. Speaking of monarchs, let's drift into their eccentric daily routines, which were often a blend of practicality, superstition, and personal obsession. Kings and queens of Scotland had to maintain appearances, manage households, and plan for potential invasions or political crises, all while eating, sleeping, and sometimes pursuing personal hobbies. James IV, for instance, had an interest in medicine and astrology. He would study texts, observe the stars, and consult physicians, all in the hopes of staying healthy and making wise decisions. It's comforting to imagine a king quietly scribbling notes in a candlelit chamber, slightly concerned about a minor cough or an ill-omened alignment of stars. Queens, too, had routines that were meticulous and often draining. Daily prayers, social visits, supervision of servants, and oversight of children could occupy hours. Mary, Queen of Scots, had to navigate her own household, her children, and the subtle manipulations of her courtiers. Even a small temper tantrum from a child could become a topic of discussion for days. These routines were full of minor stress, careful politeness, and occasional quiet frustration, a perfect environment for gentle historical reflection. Royal households were also full of small, recurring tragedies. Illness was frequent, especially among children who were vulnerable to a range of minor but persistent ailments. Food could spoil, servants might make errors, and a poorly timed letter could inadvertently cause offence. Each of these incidents was managed with calm politeness, careful adjustment, and sometimes a hint of exasperation. The rhythm of daily life was steady, slow, and punctuated by these little misadventures, ideal for a sleepy, monotone narrative. Let's also consider travel and movement.
Scottish monarchs frequently had to move between castles, manage estates, and visit distant regions. Roads were muddy, weather was unpredictable, and horses were prone to spooking. A journey that might seem straightforward today could take days, involve minor accidents, and produce gentle frustration for everyone involved. Yet these travels were routine, expected, and quietly unavoidable. For a royal, there was no dramatic escape, just the slow progression from one obligation to the next, often in rain or fog, with minor annoyances along the way. Meanwhile, the nobles continued their subtle intrigues, quietly jockeying for position. Minor disagreements about land, succession, or ceremonial precedence could simmer for years. Letters were sent, alliances formed, and polite pressure applied. These slow-moving power struggles rarely resulted in dramatic confrontation. Instead, they created a background hum of tension that shaped the lives of kings, queens, and ordinary people alike. Even the architecture of castles contributed to daily challenges. Castles were drafty, damp, and difficult to maintain. Repairs required labour, materials, and constant supervision. Royal apartments could be uncomfortable, kitchens understocked, and the cold pervasive. Yet these structures also offered protection, social prestige, and a slow rhythm of domestic life. Maintain, repair, feed, observe, repeat. In a way, the castles themselves were participants in the quiet drama of medieval Scotland. And of course, there were ceremonies and rituals, which could be both beautiful and exhausting. Every audience, banquet, or court assembly demanded attention, politeness, and careful management of appearances. One misstep, a missing bow, a mispronounced title could ripple subtly through court life. For the royal household, these rituals were a continuous reminder that minor details mattered. Even the smallest ceremonial error could become a gentle source of tension, quietly shaping the day-to-day existence of everyone involved. And finally, let's float toward the emotional landscape of these quiet lives. Monarchs, nobles, and even ordinary families experienced slow, persistent stresses. Anxiety, frustration, and exhaustion were common companions. Yet there was also resilience. People adapted to weather, politics, and personal quirks with careful patience. Life in medieval Scotland was rarely dramatic, rarely sudden, but consistently demanding. The rhythm of small disasters, minor intrigues, and subtle challenges provided structure, continuity, and a gentle, if ironic, stability. As Part 6 draws to a close, imagine the Scottish landscape once more. Mist over rolling hills, the faint outline of castles in the distance, courtiers moving with quiet purpose, and kings and queens engaged in their small daily dramas. Life was slow, measured, and filled with subtle challenges. Yet this was precisely the rhythm that allowed the kingdom to endure. And for us, the gentle ebb and flow of these events make for perfect bedtime reflection.
Part 7. Subtle Court Tragedies and Minor Illnesses. Welcome back, dear listener. Settle yourself once more, perhaps adjust your pillow, and let's float gently into the quieter, slower tragedies of medieval Scottish court life. By now, you've traveled through eccentric monarchs, minor rebellions, and subtle intrigues. Tonight, we're focusing on the small, persistent misfortunes that shaped daily life: illness, accidents, and the kind of minor crises that stretched over months, sometimes years, perfect for a slow, meditative historical journey. Let's begin with illness in the royal household, which was both common and quietly disruptive. Disease in medieval Scotland did not roar dramatically. It crept in, subtly undermining strength and stability. Children were particularly vulnerable. A cough, a fever, or a mild rash could quickly consume the attention of the household. Physicians were consulted, remedies applied, and advice debated for hours. Treatments could involve herbal concoctions, bloodletting, or the occasional bizarre charm. And while some methods were harmless, others, such as consuming questionable ingredients, were mildly inconvenient at best and slightly tragic at worst. Even adult royals were not immune. Kings and queens could be struck down by minor but persistent conditions, headaches, digestive complaints, joint pain, or occasional fevers. These ailments rarely killed, but they limited activity and required careful management. Court life continued around them, full of obligations and ceremonies, but the subtle weight of illness colored daily interactions. A king might sigh quietly over a council meeting while his physician recommended a diet of strange broths. A queen might retreat to her chamber with a mild headache, leaving advisors to navigate minor negotiations without her input. Alongside illness, accidents, and domestic mishaps were commonplace. Castles were drafty, kitchens busy, and servants prone to error. A spilled tray of food could create hours of polite fuss. A slipped stair might require several attendants to assist a noble. Even the most mundane of incidents could ripple through daily life, affecting schedules, moods, and courtly etiquette. These were not dramatic disasters. They were slow, steady reminders of the fragility and minor unpredictability inherent in medieval life. We can also drift gently into emotional subtleties. Royal children, for example, often had moods that subtly influenced the household. A tantrum, a refusal to eat, or a sudden bout of tearfulness could occupy hours of adult attention. Courtiers would observe discreetly, noting potential political consequences or family tensions. The events were minor, but their accumulation over days and weeks shaped relationships, decisions, and even succession planning. In other words, a small emotional ripple could create long-term waves, all without anyone ever raising their voice. Another factor was dietary challenges. Food in the royal household was meant to be plentiful, varied, and nutritious, but medieval understanding of nutrition was imperfect. Meals often followed humoral theory, balancing warm and cold, dry and moist. A dish deemed too hot could prompt adjustments in schedule, temperament, or minor illness management. Spices, imported delicacies, and preserved foods were expensive and sometimes ineffective at preventing spoilage. So even the act of eating, a daily necessity, could subtly influence health, mood, and courtly interactions. Meanwhile, nobles and courtiers had their own small dramas. Marriage negotiations, inheritance disputes, and ceremonial precedents created slow-moving tension. Letters were exchanged with meticulous politeness, alliances subtly shifted, and minor offenses lingered in memory for years. Unlike sudden battles, these issues unfolded gradually, requiring patience, careful observation, and mild exasperation from all parties involved. Then there was the ever-present anxiety about succession, a quietly pervasive concern. If a child fell ill or grew up fragile, nobles and advisors fretted about future stability. The death of a minor heir could trigger months of political adjustment, polite debate, and strategic positioning.
A king might spend hours considering minor details of succession, while a queen oversaw the health and education of multiple children, each with its own personality and vulnerabilities. These slow-moving pressures created a rhythm of tension that underpinned every aspect of court life. Daily routines, meanwhile, remained highly structured. Monarchs attended prayers, audiences, and feasts, supervised household staff, and managed correspondence. Nobles balanced obligations, appearances, and minor intrigues. Each activity carried weight, but none were dramatic. Instead, the rhythm of court life was measured, predictable, and occasionally frustrating, perfect for meditation through historical narrative. Even weather and landscape played a quiet role in these minor tragedies. Wet roads delayed travel, muddy fields complicated work, and harsh winters affected health and productivity. Castles offered protection, but often at the cost of damp halls, smoky kitchens, and drafty chambers. Royals and nobles endured these challenges patiently, often with mild exasperation, while peasants continued the slow, repetitive work of maintaining farms and estates. Finally, it's worth noting the subtle humor in all this. From spilled food to minor illness, fainting children, and eccentric routines, medieval Scottish life was filled with small ironies. Everyone, from king to peasant, navigated these issues with a combination of patience, observation, and occasional mild complaint. Nothing explosive, nothing dramatic, just a steady flow of life's little challenges, each one quietly shaping the next. As Part 7 drifts to a close, picture the Scottish highlands at dusk. Castles silhouetted against misty hills, courtiers moving quietly, children cared for with meticulous attention, and a gentle, almost hypnotic rhythm to daily life. Life was slow, carefully managed, and full of subtle tragedies. But in that slow, persistent flow, there is a peculiar beauty, a quiet meditation on human endurance, eccentricity, and minor misfortune. Part 8. Slow-moving politics and eccentric royal hobbies. Welcome back, friends. Settle into your blankets once more. Maybe adjust your pillow just so, and let's drift gently into another layer of medieval Scottish life. The slow, steady rhythm of politics, eccentric hobbies of monarchs, and minor disasters in daily governance. By now you can feel the pattern. Life was filled with subtle tension, tiny inconveniences, and quietly ironic twists, all moving at a pace that is oddly soothing when narrated calmly. Let's begin with slow-moving political decisions. Kings and queens of Scotland often faced situations where every choice was laden with consequence, but the consequences themselves were rarely immediate. A dispute over land, an inheritance question, or a minor treaty could drag on for months or even years. Nobles, advisors, and courtiers debated endlessly, sending letters, attending audiences, and weighing minor advantages. Decisions were made deliberately, cautiously, and sometimes tediously. A monarch might spend hours weighing a small issue, only to find that the world had subtly shifted by the time the decision was implemented. Take James IV, for instance. While he was a competent and curious king, his attention to detail meant that many decisions unfolded slowly. He balanced relations with neighboring England, managed clan disputes, and oversaw domestic administration. Each task required careful observation, polite negotiation, and patience.
The result was a rhythm of governance that was slow but surprisingly stable. Minor frustrations, repeated delays, and subtle ironies were the constants of daily life. Now let's drift to the eccentric hobbies of monarchs, which added color to court life and occasionally mild disruption. James IV had interests in medicine, astrology, and architecture. He observed the stars, studied medical texts, and commissioned buildings that may or may not have been entirely practical. James V, meanwhile, enjoyed poetry, music, and elaborate ceremonies. Mary, Queen of Scots, maintained a keen eye for fashion, jewelry, and courtly display. These hobbies, while charming and personally fulfilling, often created gentle tension with courtiers who expected attention, obedience, and punctuality. A king absorbed in a new architectural plan might neglect a minor feud, or a queen focused on embroidery might inadvertently anger an advisor. These small imbalances were the quiet drama of the court. The administration of daily governance also provided subtle complications. Tax collection, estate management, and the implementation of decrees were slow, bureaucratic processes. Instructions could be misinterpreted, messages delayed by weather, and minor rebellions quietly festered. Monarchs had to attend audiences, review petitions, and supervise a household of dozens, all while maintaining appearances. The result was a daily schedule packed with minor crises, polite negotiation, and carefully managed exasperation. Even royal correspondence could create gentle headaches. Letters between kings, queens, nobles, and foreign rulers required careful phrasing. A misplaced word or slightly ambiguous phrase could be interpreted as offense or threat. Courtiers spent hours drafting, revising, and approving these letters, all under the watchful eye of the monarch. Nothing dramatic happened, but the process consumed time, energy, and patience. Perfect for a slow, hypnotic narrative. Travel and logistics were another subtle source of minor disasters. Scottish monarchs frequently moved between castles, estates, and regions to assert authority, oversee governance, or attend ceremonial events. Roads were muddy, rivers difficult to cross, and weather unpredictable. Horses could spook, carts could break, and minor delays were common. Yet travel was essential, and each journey became part of the slow, deliberate rhythm of court life. Let's not forget the role of advisors, who could be both helpful and exasperating. Some offered sound counsel, while others pursued personal agendas through subtle influence. Monarchs needed to balance advice with personal judgment, often spending long hours in council while courtiers quietly jockeyed for influence. The result was a landscape of patience, observation, and occasional mild frustration. Again, the perfect material for a gentle, monotonous narrative. Ceremonial life added another subtle layer of complexity. Every audience, banquet, and courtly event required precise timing, polite gestures, and careful attention to etiquette. One misstep, a mispronounced title, a forgotten bow, or a poorly placed seat could ripple through the court in minor waves of irritation. Royals and nobles alike navigated this landscape with steady composure and occasionally quiet exasperation, maintaining appearances while managing countless small details. Even castle maintenance contributed to daily rhythm. Roofs leaked, walls crumbled, kitchens required constant oversight, and servants occasionally erred. Each minor mishap required careful correction. Nothing dramatic happened, just slow, continuous management of physical spaces and human habits, ensuring the household ran smoothly despite persistent minor annoyances. Finally, it's worth noting the underlying humor in all of this. Monarchs absorbed in astrology, courtiers fretting over protocol, minor rebellions simmering in the background. These small, persistent ironies give medieval Scotland a peculiar charm. Life was slow, deliberate, and full of minor complications. But there was a rhythm, a predictable ebb and flow, and a quiet fascination in the daily habits, eccentricities, and subtle ironies of medieval Scottish life.
Part 9. Ceremonial Disasters and Quiet Social Pressures. Welcome back, dear listener. Settle into your blanket, maybe adjust your pillow, and let's drift gently into another facet of medieval Scottish life: ceremonial disasters, awkward public appearances, and the subtle, persistent social pressures that shaped noble households. By now, you've witnessed minor rebellions, eccentric hobbies, and slow-moving politics. Tonight, we focus on the small public missteps and expectations that added texture, if not drama, to everyday life. First, let's consider ceremonial life, which was simultaneously beautiful and exhausting. Feasts, audiences, coronations, and religious events all demanded precision, attention to protocol, and endless patience. Each participant needed to know their place, posture, and speaking turn. A mispronounced title or incorrectly placed chair could quietly embarrass a noble and ripple subtly through the court. Nothing dramatic, just gentle tension, slow reactions, and hours of polite correction. For kings and queens, attending these ceremonies required patience, composure, and often quiet exasperation. Take James V, for example. He was deeply interested in courtly display, music, and pageantry, yet his enthusiasm sometimes collided with the slow-moving realities of medieval life. Servants misplaced ceremonial objects, courtiers argued about seating precedence, and the weather occasionally ruined elaborate outdoor spectacles. These small irritations were minor disasters in context, but they were long-lasting. Hours, sometimes days, were spent smoothing over misunderstandings, quietly adjusting arrangements, and ensuring that appearances remained flawless, or at least acceptable. Similarly, Mary, Queen of Scots, navigated public appearances with meticulous attention, though not always successfully. Every gesture, every word, every dress selection carried subtle political and social meaning. Minor errors, a tilted crown, a misaligned sash, a slightly forgotten bow, could be noticed and remembered. Courtiers, always vigilant, recorded these lapses in letters, anecdotes, or mild gossip. Mary's life was a steady balancing act, maintaining dignity, projecting authority, and quietly enduring the endless scrutiny of nobles, diplomats, and advisors. Social pressure within noble households was equally persistent, though not performative. Marriages, inheritance, and family alliances created a slow rhythm of expectation. Children were raised with careful attention to manners, education, and temperament. A minor misstep, refusing a lesson, spilling a drink, or speaking out of turn, could trigger hours of polite admonishment. These were not dramatic punishments. They were subtle, persistent, and shaped personalities over years. The pressure to conform was constant, yet gentle enough to blend seamlessly into the fabric of daily life. Even travel to court or ceremonial events could be a source of minor tension. Roads were muddy, rivers flooded, and weather was unpredictable. Nobles traveled with retinues, tents, and supplies, often arriving days late or slightly disheveled. Hosts would respond with polite concern, minor adjustments, and sometimes quiet sighs. These small misadventures rarely escalated into larger conflicts, but they added texture and a gentle unpredictability to the rhythms of noble life. Household management contributed as well. Castles and manors required continuous oversight. Kitchens prepared meals, servants cleaned halls, and stable hands managed horses. A small mistake, a burnt meal, a broken chair, or missing candle could cause subtle disruption. Royals and nobles navigated these inconveniences with calm composure, ensuring that life proceeded with minimal embarrassment and maximum efficiency. Religious obligations added another layer. Daily prayers, church attendance, and observance of holy days were strictly monitored. Failing to perform rituals properly could provoke mild gossip, polite correction, or careful notation by clergy. Nothing dramatic occurred, but the ever-present awareness of spiritual expectation created a continuous background of gentle tension, influencing both behavior and mood. Even minor feuds and disputes contributed to courtly tension. Conflicts over land, titles, or precedence were rarely resolved in a day. Negotiations, letters, and ceremonial compromises stretched over months or years. Royals acted as mediators, nobles as careful strategists, and minor incidents accumulated into subtle patterns of influence and social hierarchy. Observing these processes from a distance, one can see the slow, deliberate machinery of Scottish society in motion. And yet, amid these pressures, there was room for quiet humor and eccentricity. Royals could obsess over astrology, clothing, or small hobbies. Courtiers might craft elaborate schemes over trivial matters. Children occasionally performed minor acts of rebellion. Illnesses, domestic mishaps, and weather inconveniences added subtle absurdity to daily life. Nothing was dramatic. Everything was gradual, predictable, and gently ironic, a perfect lullaby of history. As Part 9 drifts to a close, picture a Scottish banquet hall. Banners hanging slightly askew, courtiers adjusting to seating arrangements, children quietly watched by tutors, and the king or queen moving through the room with carefully measured gestures. Life was slow, repetitive, and full of minor tension, but it was the consistency, the rhythm, and the gentle layering of small events that gave medieval Scotland its quiet charm.
Part 10. Leisure, Hobbies, and the Quiet Domestic Drama. Welcome back one last time. Settle in, take a deep breath, and let's drift gently into the final layer of our exploration. The slow, domestic, and oddly charming aspects of medieval Scottish royal life. By now, we've traveled through rebellions, ceremonial mishaps, minor illnesses, eccentric hobbies, and subtle social pressures. Tonight, we'll focus on the quieter rhythms of leisure, personal quirks, and the gentle domestic dramas that defined daily life behind castle walls. Let's begin with royal leisure, which was a careful balance of status, personal enjoyment, and gentle social expectation. Kings and queens had hobbies, often pursued in long stretches of quiet focus. James IV dabbled in architecture, astrology, and medicine. Mary, Queen of Scots, spent time on fashion, embroidery, and music. These pursuits were calming for the royals themselves, but occasionally mildly inconvenient for courtiers, who might wait politely while the monarch observed a constellation or carefully adjusted a ceremonial dress. Leisure was structured, deliberate, and slightly self-indulgent, but always within the framework of responsibility and expectation. Games and entertainment were also part of daily life, though often slow and predictable. Board games, music, storytelling, and quiet contests of skill were common. Nobles and royals alike engaged in these activities with decorum and patience. Victory or failure was rarely dramatic. It was noted, politely acknowledged, and incorporated into the slow rhythm of courtly interaction.
Even competitions could generate subtle tension, gossip, or gentle rivalry, but all unfolded gradually, leaving time for reflection and minor emotional adjustments. Personal quirks and eccentricities added color to domestic life. Royals often had preferences for certain foods, rituals, or daily routines. A king might insist on observing the stars each evening, while a queen might require a particular arrangement of pillows or candles. Courtiers accommodated these quirks with polite obedience, sometimes noting them for posterity or gentle amusement. Eccentricities could influence minor decisions, household arrangements, and daily schedules, but in a quiet, predictable way that shaped life without dramatic upheaval. Meanwhile, household management remained a continuous, slow-moving challenge. Kitchens, chambers, stables, and gardens all demanded attention. Minor mishaps, a burnt dish, spilled wine, or a loose gate were handled politely, with adjustments made as needed. Courtiers and servants learned patience, observation, and careful compliance, while royals exercised gentle authority over their environment. Life was rhythmically predictable. Observe, correct, adjust, repeat. Children added another layer of quiet domestic drama. Royal offspring required education, supervision, and guidance, all carefully monitored to preserve health, behavior, and future political utility. Tantrums, illness, and minor rebellion were commonplace, managed with patience, gentle admonishment, and occasional mild frustration. These small incidents accumulated over time, shaping personalities and subtly influencing the broader courtly environment. Even minor festivals and celebrations were exercises in slow ritual. Seasonal events, religious holidays, and local gatherings involved careful planning, polite interactions, and incremental adjustments. A misstep, such as a misaligned banner or a slightly late participant, was corrected calmly and subtly, often producing minor amusement or quiet exasperation. Nothing dramatic occurred. The rhythm itself was the story, and observing it provides a gentle sense of continuity. Finally, let's consider the enduring irony of royal life. Scottish monarchs were privileged, powerful, and often eccentric, but they were also vulnerable to slow, persistent frustrations. Minor illnesses, domestic mishaps, social pressures, and subtle political intrigues shaped every day. Their lives were not filled with explosive drama, but with steady, ironic patterns of human behavior. Cautious planning, careful observation, minor missteps, and occasional gentle triumphs. This slow rhythm, punctuated by small crises and quiet joys, gives us the full texture of medieval Scottish life. So, as we drift toward the conclusion of our exploration, picture the final scene. A Scottish castle at twilight, banners fluttering lazily in the wind, candles flickering in drafty chambers, courtiers moving quietly along stone corridors, and royals engaged in their slow, deliberate routines. Children rest, servants complete minor tasks, and the quiet ebb and flow of domestic life continues unnoticed by history. Life in medieval Scotland was slow, patterned, and full of minor frustrations, but also filled with subtle beauty, ironic persistence, and gentle human eccentricity. And with that, our long journey through the quietly tragic, mildly absurd, and gently ironic world of medieval Scotland comes to a close. As you drift toward sleep, remember, history is rarely dramatic in the cinematic sense. Often it is composed of small, repetitive patterns, minor disasters, and subtle, enduring rhythms. In the lives of Scottish kings, queens, nobles, and children, we find a lullaby of human behavior, observed in slow motion, perfectly suited to reflection, meditation, and rest. Good night, and may your dreams carry you softly through misty highlands, quiet castles, and the gentle and persistent rhythms of history.